Right. So that we can be, just in case we're not too sure what the Bible is, if anyone's uncertain, the Bible is a collection of books that are fixed in its number, divine in its origin, and universal in its authority. That is what Bible-believing Christians believe. Just closing in a little bit on that, it contains some 66 separate books, some in the Old Testament, some in the New, 39, 27. Some 40 different writers over a period of around 1,600 years. And it has one author. I call the contributors in the Bible as writers, and the author is God. And there is one big story that runs right through the Bible. Now, this is something people don't often understand. They think the Bible is simply a collection of miscellaneous stories. They're not stories, they're accounts and records. There are some stories in the Bible, but people think of stories as myths and fairy tales. That is not the Bible. After his resurrection, Jesus said to his disciples, "This is what I told you while I was still with you. Everything must be fulfilled that is written about me in the law of Moses and the prophets and the Psalms." Now that, for the Jews, was the whole of what we call the Old Testament, the Hebrew Scriptures. That covered everything. So he's saying that throughout the Bible, throughout the Old Testament Scriptures, throughout the Hebrew Scriptures, I was the center of what they were talking about. Then he opened their minds so they could understand Scriptures, and he told them, this is what is written: the Christ will suffer and rise from the dead on the third day, and repentance and forgiveness of sins will be preached in his name to all nations, beginning at Jerusalem. Now, whether someone believes it or not, we have to recognize these are the Bible's own claims. The prophets in the Old Testament were constantly saying, this is what the sovereign Lord says. Jesus himself told his disciples, the Spirit will guide you into all truth. Paul wrote in his letters, we speak in words taught by the Spirit, and Peter said similarly, we were not writing cleverly invented stories, but eyewitnesses of the truth. Luke, the writer of the Acts of the Apostles and the Gospel of Luke, says, I myself have carefully investigated everything. And John, who also wrote the Gospel, we proclaim what we have seen and heard. In other words, the Bible, whether we believe it or not, is clear in its self-professed claim that it is reliable. Now, I want to make it clear what I am doing and what I'm not doing here this evening. I cannot prove to you tonight that the Bible is the Word of God. You can question that afterwards if you want and say, well, how do we know it is? What I'm seeking to do is just two very simple things. I want to show that the Bible is historically reliable wherever it can be checked with known events and people. Now, I can't cover them all, obviously, but I'm going to give you a taster of the kind of situations where we can, when the Bible is checked, it is found to be true. And secondly, that it shows evidence of first-hand eyewitness accounts. Again, we're just going to take a toe in to the subject and have a look at some examples of it. I'm going to start with staying really with the Old Testament to begin with, and then we'll shift to the New. But people in the Bible who, as I put it, were discovered in the ground. Now, these are all people who at one time assumed didn't exist because we had no knowledge of them outside. But as we move through the Old Testament, it becomes even clearer. Professor Donald Wiseman, who until his death a few years ago was a very outstanding and Bible-believing archaeologist, said to me on one occasion, the Bible archaeology properly understood always confirms the accuracy of the Bible. And that really is a basis for what we are thinking about. Archaeology, correctly understood, always confirms the accuracy of the Bible. Now let's go back pretty much as far as we can archaeologically. Noah and the global flood. It may interest you to know that a catastrophic flood is found in the ancient traditions of nations right across the world. There's a few countries there, and except the continent of Antarctica, these are represented in nation after nation across all the continents. That means we have to ask the question, where did they come from if there was not at one time a global flood? Let me just focus in on one of those many traditions, and this is the one that is closest to the biblical account in the book of Genesis. It's known as the Gilgamesh Epic. The story is very simply told. The Gilgamesh meets up with a guy called Utnapishtim, and Utnapishtim found immortality. Gilgamesh wants it as well. He doesn't actually get it, but that's the end of the story. Utnapishtim told him how he got it. The god Ea told him that there was going to be a terrible flood. He was to take representatives of all the animal kingdom into a big ark that he would build. In his case, it was a big 5-decker, which of course was completely nonsense because it would have just toppled over in a flood, whereas Noah's was properly built and has been demonstrated today, would have floated. It didn't have to go anywhere, it only had to float. But Gilgamesh's was a 5-decker. He took his family in, the animals, and some of the workmen as well. The flood was a terrible cataclysmic storm that frightened even the lesser gods, according to the Gilgamesh Epic. And it lasted only a week, and then it hit dry land because the flood subsided. He got out, worshipped his gods, and so on. Now, those of you who know the Noah story in Genesis will see there are similarities. And this one is a story that is they think is a copy. It's dated about 650 BC, but probably a much older one than that. Whether the older copy that we don't have, so that can't be proved, predates Noah or not, is anyone's guess. But the biblical story of Noah is a very sound, sane account. That's as close as we can go, if you like, to Noah. Because if you ask for any archaeological evidence, you can get geological evidence, but that's not my subject, so don't waste your time asking a question on that this evening. Don't forget, though, that in the Old Testament, Isaiah, Jesus, and Peter in the New Testament all believed in a global flood, and they made that absolutely clear. Let's move on just a little bit, because when we come to Abraham, we're only marginally better off. There is no archaeology that actually we can dig up and says, here's Abraham. However, whereas people concluded that the book of Genesis and the accounts of Abraham didn't really fit what happened 2000 BC, that is no longer accepted. When the Maori documents were discovered, now Maori was the ancient capital of the Ammonites, and they are mentioned some 70 times in the Old Testament. They were a very important people, and their capital was discovered. It's in modern-day Turkey. The palace alone was a huge place, covering many, many acres, and a palace of 200 rooms. But what was much more important was there were 20,000 clay documents discovered. After all, paper wasn't invented then, so everything was on clay, and that's a good thing because it lasts a long time. And those who have studied them, and Dr. Daniel Fleming is one who spent his academic career almost just studying these documents, recognized that actually this is only 200 years or so on from Abraham. So really, since society changed very little, this is his time. That there is so much in these documents that reflect what's going on in Genesis. The names are the same. Now, these are not Bible people, but the names are there: Noah, Abraham, Laban, Jacob, Gad, Dan, and Levi. Many places mentioned in the Old Testament are there in the book of Genesis, are there in the Maori documents. And all the social structure reflected in the Maori documents is exactly that which is reflected in the book of Genesis. And therefore, we have archaeological evidence that what we read in Genesis is exactly what we know was the time, the place, the names, and so on of the book of the time of Abraham. But of course, as we move on, we get closer to that which is easier to demonstrate. Now, you may not know, but David, King David, and all the history beforehand of Israel is by many critics, or I should say was by many critics, though many still hold on to it, was made up somewhere around the 5th or the 6th centuries BC to give the people of Israel who were in exile a history and to boost their morale. And therefore everything before, well, this includes David and Solomon, so everything before Solomon is made up just to give Israel a history. There wasn't a David. And anyway, we have no archaeological evidence of a David. Well, until the Tel Dan inscription was discovered. Now, the Tel Dan inscription is significant because the king Hazael of Syria, referred to in the Bible as Aram, but that's Syria, King Hazael records how he killed the king of Israel, that's the bit in the north after the kingdom divided, and the king of the phrase he uses is the dynasty or the house of David. We've circled there, though you can't see it very clearly. It's much clearer. Well, it's not much clearer there, actually. But that is the house of David. Now, all archaeologists now accept that this is a reference to David. And what is significant is this is less than 200 years after David himself and many centuries before the stories of David were apparently made up in the 5th or 6th century BC. So there has to be a swing. Of course, they don't accept that David was the great king that the Bible refers to him as because they're not going to let go of that. But now it has to be accepted that there was a King David. And that, of course, is a pointer because if that's correct, maybe, just maybe, all the history beforehand is correct. Anyway, when you stop and think of it psychologically, it's sheer nonsense to believe that the stories of David, the records of David, were made up to give a great history of this great king that kick-started the monarchy in Israel. Most of you who know anything about your Bible will know that there's more than one or two stories about David in the Old Testament that you would not make up to show that he was a great model king for Israel. So David, he's there, and nobody can dispute it. Jehu was not really he was a king of the northern territory in Israel. He wasn't really a direct descendant. He was a butcher that butchered his way to power. Incidentally, he's the one who drove his chariot furiously. He invented Formula One. And Jehu was a king who had made a lot of enemies, so he needed a friend. And the Bible records how he actually went along to one of the kings of Assyria, the big guy on the block at the time. Syria was the commanding empire. And he took some gifts to him. And what you're looking at here is known as the Black Obelisk. It's in the British Museum. And on the second road down, Shalmaneser III, the king of Assyria, records how Jehu, the son of Omri, he wasn't actually the son of Omri, he usurped that position, but Shalmaneser wouldn't necessarily know that. Shalmaneser of Assyria refers to Jehu bringing him tribute. So here is a king of Israel who is confirmed by one of the greatest monarch of the ancient Near East of his day. The same is true of Shalmaneser III also claimed on this called a stela, which is it's a lump of stone, and on the front is the carved picture of Shalmaneser III. But if you go to the back of it, he tells the account of 12 kings that put an army into the field against him. And among those 12 kings, incidentally, is also Hazael, the one we've just been talking about. But among them is Ahab. He's the husband of Jezebel. You may not have heard of Ahab, but you've heard of Jezebel. And he actually tells us that Ahab put 10,000 infantry and 2,000 chariots into this battle. There's another king who's mentioned. But this is interesting because these little things are what are known as bulle. They are the impression of a royal seal. Well, they don't have to be a royal seal, of a seal of somebody important. They are the ID card, if you like. They're the visa card of people in the ancient world. And this one is a seal of Ahaz, another king of Judah. This one is a seal of Hezekiah, the son of Ahaz, king of Judah. And rather intriguingly, this one is the seal of Shebna, the palace steward. Now, he's mentioned in Isaiah 22. Lock that reference in, if you like. He's been a very naughty boy, and he gets a very good hiding in the book of Isaiah. But it's interesting that the palace steward, we also have a seal of his. Now, these are just typical of many seals that are found of names of people actually in the Bible. And nobody disputes this. Everything I tell you this evening is indisputable by the world of scholarship and archaeology, unless I say there are queries. So I ain't making anything up for you. Now here's another king who never existed, the one on the left. There's one verse in the Bible, Isaiah 20 and verse 1, which refers to Sargon, the king of Assyria. For many, many years, there was no reference to Sargon anywhere except one verse in the Bible. So guess what? He didn't exist. He was a made-up name from the Bible. That is until 1843, the middle of the 19th century, when Paul Emile Borter, a French archaeologist, actually discovered Sargon's fortress. He had made at Khorsabad, he had made on the Euphrates, he had made a brand new capital for himself. And his name is clearly there. No one doubts Sargon today. As a matter of fact, this guy caused more trouble than you might imagine, because he is the one who actually defeated the Samaria, the capital of the northern territory of Israel, in the year 722 BC. And he did what all the despots of the time did. He took the cream of the population out of Israel and took them into exile in his country and other countries he'd conquered. And he put in their place other people. The idea was to stir in the population so there was less likelihood of anybody rising an insurrection against him. But of course, the people who came in brought with them their own gods, their own false religions, and they mixed it with the people in Samaria in the north. And that's why the people in the south, Jerusalem, didn't like the people in the north, Samaria, because they had a messed up worship of Yahweh. So whenever you come across this verse in John 4 and verse 9, the Jews do not associate with Samaritans. Think Sargon. It's all his fault. And on that lump of clay you're seeing there is his own record of taking people from Samaria into exile. Again, another link that demonstrates the biblical account is absolutely trustworthy. That's Sargon. Facing Sargon is someone who is almost certainly, though there's a little bit of doubt, some think he's just a courtier, but he's more likely Sennacherib, his son. Sargon didn't last very long. He was killed in battle soon after he finished his beautiful Khorsabad, and his son Sennacherib took on the role. Sennacherib had an empire which was beginning to seethe, and there was a lot of discontent. And amongst that was Hezekiah, the king in Jerusalem. And Hezekiah hadn't been paying his rent, his tribute, and so Sennacherib decided he had to do something about it. And this is what Sennacherib's own record says. This isn't a Bible verse, this is Sennacherib. He said, "As to Hezekiah the Jew, I laid siege to 46 of his strong cities, walled forts, and to the countless small villages in their vicinity. He took his great Assyrian army, trundling through the land of Judah, and he destroyed, on his own words, 46 towns and cities, until he wound up at the second most important city next to Jerusalem, and that was Lakeish. At Lakeish, the Bible indicates that he laid siege to Lakeish. Now, here's an interesting thing. In all of the records of Sennacherib, in all of his, and there's a lot of his records that have been discovered, he never mentions the siege of Lakeish. So how would we know it exists? Well, because when his great palace was discovered at Nineveh, and that's a story in itself, because at one time people assumed that didn't exist because we had no evidence of it. But when it was discovered, they found what is known as the Lakeish Victory Room, a room that has 60 feet of wall plaques illustrating the siege and the defeat of Lakeish. So although we have no textual evidence, we have archaeological evidence dug out of the ground. And this is quite fascinating. This is just one little part of it. You can see the battering ram going up there, and this is how we know what ancient battering rams looked like. I'd love to tell you more about that, but I must move on. There are people escaping the city. There are the salt troops going up. I might as well show you them. They're escaping the city, or salt troops going up. These ice cream cones coming down are firebrands trying to set light to the battering ram. There's the scaling ladders, and down here on the bottom right-hand corner, there is an early form of crucifixion. The Assyrians would put a stake through a man's groin or his stomach and leave him to die. Now, this whole plan is there. There is no question. And when this was dug up by Austin Henry Layard in the middle of the 19th century, it made international news. It was the first time a Bible account was literally coming out of the ground. Meanwhile, back in Jerusalem, Hezekiah had about 4 years to prepare for a siege, because it took a long time for the Assyrian army to do all this damage through Judea. And one of the things Hezekiah had to do was to make sure Jerusalem had enough water and the enemies outside had none. So he diverted an outside stream into the city, and he did a marvelous piece of engineering work that engineers today are still not sure how it could be done. A tunnel, and you can see a colleague of mine is walking through it ahead there, and a tunnel that you can walk through wound 533 meters under the city. It does wind a bit, and it's 49 meters down, and it ends up in what is now known as the Pool of Siloam. An incredible feat of engineering. And that's exactly what the Bible talks about. He channeled water down to the west side of the city of David, the tunnel by which he brought water into the city. And if you doubt that verse, you can walk through it today. Again, just another many instance of a Bible verse coming alive because found to be true. Now, the prophet Isaiah promised, this is what the Lord says concerning the king of Assyria. He'll not enter this city or shoot an arrow there. He'll not come before it with shield or build a siege ramp against it. He will not enter this city. Now, that looked ridiculous, because every kingdom, every nation that Sennacherib conquered, he records the king that he captured, except one, and that's Hezekiah. Because he never broke into the city, and if you know the account, an unseen hand slew the larger part of his army overnight, and he had to go back to Assyria, where a few years later 2 of his sons assassinated him. But when he went back, he did 2 things. He did this great victory wall, because you never lost a battle in the ancient world, of course. This great victory wall doesn't mention Jerusalem. It's Lakeish. Oh, but he does mention Jerusalem. He mentions it on what is known as the Taylor Prism. And all he says is that he shut up Hezekiah in Jerusalem like a bird in the cage. The problem was he couldn't open the cage door and get the bird out. That fits perfectly with what we know. We could say a lot more about that, but we must move on. Here's another king who never existed. The book of Daniel mentions on a number of occasions that the king in Babylon at this particular time was called Belshazzar. Daniel, you got it wrong. You've made up a name, because there's no Belshazzar anywhere. And in fact, worse than that, we know exactly who the king of Babylon was at that time. It's this little guy, Nabonidus. He's worshipping 3 of his gods. So how come? Big mistake? No, Daniel's spot on. This little barrel, it is only about, in old money, 6 inches long, is known as the Nabonidus Cylinder. There are 4 of them, actually. Nabonidus planted them at the corner of a temple to the moon god Sin that he had restored, and he wants us all to know. But on it, he has a prayer for himself, of course, and Belshazzar, the offspring of my heart. We can now believe in Belshazzar. Actually, there's a lot more information on Belshazzar since then. What had happened was simply this, and now we know. Nabonidus was away in Arabia fighting battles. Belshazzar was the crown prince on the throne in Babylon at the time the Persians broke in and killed the king. It was Belshazzar they killed. This is the Belshazzar, of course, of Belshazzar's feast. Another evidence of the Bible being true. Give it time. It always proves true. Cyrus, the king of Persia. The Bible maintains that when the Persians broke into Babylon on that same fateful night when Belshazzar was killed, Cyrus gave the orders. He was the king of Persia at the time, and this is now the big country on top, that the nations could go back, and specifically the Bible, of course, mentions Judea. The nations could go back home and they could rebuild their temples and take their gods back with them, all the gods that Nebuchadnezzar and Nabonidus had taken. And for many years, critics said, that's nonsense. Because, as I said earlier, what the ancient world despots always did, they took people away from the country and they put foreigners back in. This king's doing the opposite. So it's got to be wrong. Well, again, until the Cyrus Cylinder was discovered. Now, the Cyrus Cylinder, discovered in 1879, is such an important item that it sits in the British Museum in its own little glass case. And a replica is in the headquarters of the United Nations in New York, and it's been translated into all 27 of the official languages of the UN. And the reason is because it's considered to be the world's first Magna Carta freedom movement. I think that's OTT, but if they want it that way, that's fine by me. And actually on it, that Cyrus, the king of Persia, gives the nations, it doesn't mention Judea, but it gives nations the right to go back, take their gods, rebuild their cities, and rebuild their temples, exactly as we have it recorded in the Bible. Yet again, you see, the record is correct. I want to introduce you to somebody, Robert Dick Wilson. You may never have heard of him. He's an armchair archaeologist. He didn't do the digging, he did the reading. He was a pretty smart guy, professor of Semitic philology, don't worry about that, but it sounds pretty impressive, at Princeton Theological Seminary in the USA. He died just before the outbreak of the Second World War. And he learned a few language to aid his research. Just cast your eyes down that and feel suitably humbled. In fact, he learned 26 languages and dialects and then spent 15 years reading every piece of literature available at the time relating to the Bible from the ancient world. And having done that, he then published his results, which included this: I try to give my students such an intelligent faith in the Old Testament scripture that they will never doubt them as long as they live. He concluded, no man knows enough to assail the truthfulness of the Old Testament. Let me turn now to the New Testament, and I won't be quite so long here. I want to deal with something different, and this is showing authentic eyewitness accounts. And when you read your New Testament, you can do this work yourself. It's quite simple. You look for evidence that this must have been somebody who was there. I'm only going to give you a few examples. Luke, who wrote the Gospel, also wrote the Acts of the Apostles. You may never have worked it out, but he actually wrote just over a quarter of your entire New Testament. That's quite a chunk. And he is known to be a very accurate historian. And if in all the details he gives of his gospel and the Acts, we find that we can trust his record there, then perhaps we're right to trust his record on the things that could never be archaeologically proven. Let's have a look at one or two. He's never been shown to be accurate. Much of his history matches exactly with known texts and inscriptions of the first century. Now look at these details. You can work them out. These are my figures, and you can work them out for yourself. In the Gospels and Acts, he refers to 114 identifiable places. In other words, we know exactly where they were today. 25 political, military, social, and religious events, all known to history. He refers to the famine in Judea and the expulsion of the Jews from Rome under the Emperor Claudius, all found in first century texts, and 117 living people by name, many, not all, well known to history. Now, why did he do that? Because he wants you to know, if you want, you can check him out. And we can still. Not everybody, of course, but a lot of them we can check out. And I believe Luke kept a notebook. If you want to ask me about that afterwards, I'll tell you why I believe he kept a notebook. Let's just take this one. In those days, Caesar Augustus issued a decree that a census should be taken of the entire Roman world. This was the first census that took place while Quirinius was governor of Syria, and everyone went to his own town to register. Now, there are one or two issues there, which in question time I'm happy to answer if you want, but I'm going to take the last one. Everyone went to his hometown to register. What a terrible upheaval. Supposing every time there was a national census, you had to go back to where you were born. Some of you, it may have been just up the road, but most of you, I guess, would have some journey. Well, it's ridiculous, isn't it? No, not really. People didn't travel quite then like they do now. And the evidence of the truth of that is this. A Roman census order in Egypt in the time of Gaius Maximus in AD 104, that's when Trajan was an emperor, ordering all the men in Egypt to go back to their home for a census. That's what the Romans did, and you did what you're told. Let me give a little bit of evidence of eyewitness. Now, you need to think this one through. This is in John's Gospel. Philip has just met with Jesus, and he meets up with, John claims, let's run through these two very quickly. John claims that he is writing down what is true, and Luke claims that he has only writing things he investigated carefully. Philip met with Jesus, and then he found his friend Nathanael, and this was his introduction. Philip found Nathanael and told him, "We have found the one whom Moses wrote about in the law and about whom the prophets also wrote, Jesus of Nazareth, son of Joseph." Look at those words for a moment. Now, some of you were brought up on the diet that the Gospels were written about 100 or 120 years after the events, a long time after, and not, of course, by disciples of Jesus. Now, had that been the case, he would never have said Jesus of Nazareth, son of Joseph. First, because although it's true Jesus grew up in Nazareth, he was born in Bethlehem. And the proof of his messiahship is not Nazareth, but Bethlehem. Nazareth doesn't appear in the Old Testament. It's not one of the prophecies. Bethlehem, Micah 5 verse 2, Bethlehem was where all the Jews expected the Messiah to be born from, because that was the city of David. That's where great David came from. So he would have said, Jesus of Bethlehem, not Nazareth. And he wouldn't have said son of Joseph, because by then, 120 years later, actually a lot earlier than that, but we're pretending we believe that it's written 120 years later, everybody knows that he's not known as the son of Joseph, he's the Son of God. So he would have said, you would have written down when you're making up this gospel, Jesus of Bethlehem, Son of God. Oh yes, we get that. Old Testament prophecy, and who he really is. So why have we got that? Because that's all Philip knew. He's only just bumped into Jesus. He knows he comes from Nazareth. He knows he's the son of Joseph, legally. And that's all he knew. That's evidence of a first-hand account. Take this one. Some of you will be ahead of the game on this, and you know. The Pharisees brought a woman and threw her down on the sand in front of Jesus and said she's just been caught in adultery. And Moses in the Old Testament says she should be stoned. What are you going to say? What did Jesus do next? For a moment, nothing. There was a very significant silence. And then John says, he bent down and wrote with his finger on the ground. Do you know what he wrote? You have no idea, and nor has anybody. Now, if I was John, because he was there, I would have gone up immediately to see what he had written. But if he did, it was all scuffed out anyway. Maybe later on he said, Jesus, what did you write? And Jesus might have just smiled, and that was the end of it. He might have said, I was just doodling, actually. Or he may have written something, but we don't know. So why did John say it? It's completely irrelevant. Well, don't take my word for it. Take a great literary giant's word for it, C.S. Lewis. You've heard of him, haven't you? Of this very account, he says, as a literary historian, I am perfectly convinced that whatever else the Gospels are, they are not legends. I have read a great deal of legend, and I'm quite clear they are not the same sort of thing. And then referring to this account, the art of inventing little irrelevant details to make an imaginary scene more convincing is a purely modern art. They just didn't do things like that. John wrote it down because that's exactly what he saw, but he doesn't know why. And why invent an argument twice among the disciples? You're writing a document 120 years later to show what great guys these disciples are. And twice they're arguing about who's going to be the greatest. You wouldn't make that up, would you? He wrote it down because he was an honest man. And he was there. And he remembers it. Even more to the point, why on earth would all four gospel writers tell us the women were the first ones to see Jesus risen from the dead? You've got to realize that in the first century, the woman's word, like Islam today, is not worth anything as much as a man's word. So you're asking for trouble, aren't you? Of course the women will say that. They're all a bit psyched up, aren't they? They're flippant minds, they think that way. You see, a woman's word would never be taken against a man's word in the first century. So why do you say that? Why do all four say it? Because it happened that way. And they're men of integrity. And though it may, for some of them, gone a little bit against their macho grain, that's how it happened. So they wrote it down. You see what I'm saying? You read your New Testament like this, and you'll find it reads very differently in future. We're nearly through, you'll be glad to know. The detail in Luke's writing is incredible. You see, there are 5 centurions in the New Testament. He gives names to a couple of them. The centurion that accompanied Paul on his journey as a prisoner to Rome to be on trial before Nero, he gives not only his name, but the imperial cohort or the Augustan regiment. That was a real regiment. He got it right. And he gives us his name, Julian. He didn't need to. At the time, you could check it out if you wanted. You could go to the Roman records. They were brilliant at keeping records. And you could check it. Oh, and also the tribune, Claudius Lysias, in command of the cohort. He gives you his name. He's an important high-ranking Roman officer. You can check him out very, very easily. There is so much. I'll introduce you just to one more man. Sir Charles William Ramsay. William Ramsay was a bucket and spade archaeologist. Unlike Robert Dick Wilson, he dug around. When he became a Christian, well, whether he was, you can make your own judgment on. But when he began his work, he was quite brilliant. He was an archaeologist, and just run your eyes down and you'll see that he wasn't somebody to be messed with academically. He was brilliant. And he concluded, and I want you to remember as you read these words, he began by being taught in Germany by professors who said, if you're going to spend your time researching for the New Testament, which is what he wanted to do, Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey, the land of Paul's travels, you will find that Luke is wrong everywhere. He is a hopeless historian. He was literally told that. That's how he started. I could tell you the account that actually made him first question that. But the conclusion of his years of research was this: you may press the words of Luke in a degree beyond any other historians, and they stand the keenest scrutiny and the hardest treatment. Christianity did not originate in a lie, and we can and ought to demonstrate it as well as believe it. Amazing today that you can read many critics of the New Testament who never even mention William Ramsay. And what is even more amazing, sometimes they're raising the same accusations against the Bible that Ramsay answered way back. He died just before the outbreak of the Second World War. Christians have always been ridiculed for their faith, just as they are in the day in which you and I live. Nothing new at all. This is a 2nd century piece of graffiti in Rome. It's a human-headed donkey spread-eagled on a cross. And somebody has written in misspelt Greek, Alexamenos worships his God. I'll make it a bit easier for you to see. There's Alexamenos. He's worshipping his God. Silly fool. Beside it, somebody has written in Latin, Alexamenos is faithful. And I suggest that may have been Alexamenos himself. You can laugh, but I know what I'm doing. I'm worshipping Jesus Christ. One of the most moving pictures you will ever see is Leon Jerome's The Christian's Last Prayer. This really happened. Christians thrown into the arena to be gored by wild animals. And if you look closely at that picture, you will see the crosses around them. On each one of these is a Christian burning to death. Tacitus, the Roman historian, tells us that Nero lightened his garden parties by pouring pitch over Christians and burning them to death. He didn't have to make that up. He wasn't a Christian. And nothing has changed. Why are Christians all over the world prepared to die for their faith? Nothing has changed. If you go to the Garden of Gethsemane today, and you go to that little tomb, which is not the tomb Jesus was buried in, but it's somewhat like it. And if you go in, and you turn around and come out, on the inside of the door, there was, I think there still is, a notice that said, "He is not here, for he is risen." That's why Christians worship him. He who died on the cross for their sin is risen from the dead. And the resurrection demonstrates who Jesus Christ is and what he came to do. And the whole Bible, remember, is the story about Jesus. Or as Paul put it when he was writing to the church at Corinth, Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures. He was buried and he was raised on the 3rd day according to the Scriptures. I'm going to leave it there and hand over to the pastor to chair any questions that you may have.